Good afternoon again. My name is Ben Bohr, and I'm part of the research papers team here at Sloan. And it's my pleasure to introduce our next paper, which is Counterpoints, Advanced Defensive Metrics for NBA Basketball. And some mechanics about how the presentation is going to be structured. It will be 20 minutes long, followed by a 5-minute Q&A session. So please hold your questions until then. And like we've been doing throughout the event today, I will be handing around the mic to those who have questions. So please raise your hand for that. So now I'd like to introduce our two presenters, Alex Franks and Andy Miller. Please join me in welcoming them.
So in basketball, we're often interested in characterizing multiple aspects of a player's ability. So naturally, when you go to your favorite reference for NBA statistics, there's a lot of information there. But unfortunately, almost all of this information relates to offensive skill. In this particular site, of the 20 or so columns, only 3 metrics relate to defense. That's blocks, steals, and defensive rebounds. There have also been a few advanced approaches, in particular Dean Oliver's defensive rating, which is an attempt to quantify individual stops. But this is still based on course summaries of gameplay from the box score. So in a particular game, we know exactly how many points, say, Chris Paul scores, but we don't know how many points he's responsible for giving up. Similarly, with James Harden, we know how many shots he takes in a season. How many shots did he face? I can go online and get the shot chart for any player I care about, but I can't find any information about, quantitative information about how different defenders affect the game in different regions of the court. And so to explore the consequences of these lack of metrics, let's look at a clip. This is from the Spurs-Rockets Christmas Day game. And we have James Harden guarding Kawhi. He gets a little bit lost, chases him out to the perimeter, forces him off the three-point line, but then gives up a wide-open mid-range 2 because he overcommitted. Let's look at a different example. Here we have Chris Paul guarding Steph Curry in a Clippers-Warriors game. The ball gets tipped back. Again, he chases him off the line, but he stays at his hip and makes Curry take a contested shot, which is eventually missed. So game in and game out, as a fan or a coach, we recognize examples like this of good and bad defense. But this always goes unrecorded statistically. So how can we correct for this imbalance of defensive metrics in the NBA? That's the goal of our work. And in particular, we're going to focus on how defenders affect shot selection of shooters, say suppress shots, and shot disruption. Given that a shot is attempted, how does that defender affect the likelihood that that shot goes in? Well, I think by now we're used to the idea that player tracking is going to be a huge part of the future of advanced analytics. In particular, with the SportView data, we now have access to the XY positions of all 10 players on the court and the ball 25 frames a second for every game in the NBA. This amounts to literally millions of rows of data. But as much data as is available, the insight we can gain directly from that raw information is somewhat limited, in particular defensively. Why is that the case? Well, here's an animation of essentially the raw data. And you might notice that we know the identities and locations of the players, but we don't know their orientation, and most importantly, what they are doing defensively, or what they should be doing defensively. And I think this is the fundamental challenge of defensive analytics in the NBA. In order to understand defensive skill, we need to understand defensive intent first. And so our approach is to first identify the matchups for every moment of an NBA basketball game. So we develop what's called a hidden Markov model for identifying who's guarding whom in any moment of a game. And there's a lot of serious math under the hood, but the basic idea is actually fairly simple. We assume that on average, a defender guarding an offensive player lies in this triangle between the offensive player's location, the hoop, and the ball. Once we fit this model, which is actually a dynamic model, so it uses information over time for the whole possession, we can get an estimate of the average defender location, which turns out to be about 2/3 of the way between the offender and the hoop, shading about 10% of the way toward the ball. And so if we look at a particular snapshot of the data, it's very hard to tell what's going on. Now with our model, we can add in these blue lines, which represent the estimate of who's guarding whom in a possession. But remember, this is fundamentally a dynamic model. So let's watch the evolution of a possession and focus on our estimates of these matchups through the blue lines. One thing to keep in mind is that we're doing a pretty good job picking up defensive switches and double teams. We can run this model for every single game. We did run this model for every single game of the 2013-2014 season. And in particular now, this is actually part of the same possession that we saw with Chris Paul, where now the ball gets tapped back. Chris Paul contests the shot. We have a quantitative summary of who was guarding the shot taker at every point in a possession. So I'm going to pass it off to Andy, who's going to talk about how we can use this information.
So the contribution of this paper is to use that who's guarding whom model to create an ensemble of new metrics to actually quantify or attempt to quantify the disruption and suppression concepts of defense. So as Alex alluded to in the first slide, we want to come up with a notion of points against. We have points per game. We want to know how many points were scored against a particular defender. So the aspiration is to come up with this thing we're terming counterpoints. This is an estimate of the points scored against a particular defender. So it's like how many points we blame for that one defender, and we can also come up with an analog for field goal attempts, shots against, an estimate of the number of shots that were attempted against a particular defender. And our first kind of naive attempt was to assign blame to the defender at the moment of the shot. So we have all these matchups, and we can take the matchup at the moment of the shot and see how that breaks down, see how many points are being scored against those defenders. But what ended up happening was for 100, per 100 half-court possessions, we found that in general, the big men were taking most of the blame. So Kelly Olynyk was purportedly being scored against, or 41 points were being scored against him per 100 half-court possessions. So this kind of huge bias popped out. And the first 50 on this table are big men, rim protectors. And that kind of makes sense. I mean, they're the ones kind of tasked with getting, protecting the rim when players get there. And similarly, we can look at the shots against. So per 100 half-court possessions, Roy Hibbert is contesting shot 42% of that time, nearly 42% of that time. It's interesting to note his backup, Jan Maynard, is contesting about 40% of the time, ranking third among bigs. And their teammate David West is last among all of the bigs we analyzed. So this is also suggesting another point that Alex will bring up later, that all of these metrics don't exist in a vacuum. We're measuring kind of individual level defensive statistics, but we must interpret them in the context of kind of a team defensive scheme. So this is clearly indicative of the funneling that the Pacers do towards their big men. But we can do better. Now that we have the information from the entire possession, the who's guarding who model gives us these matchups moment by moment. Instead of just taking the last moment, we can average over the entire evolution of the possession. For instance, if Steph Curry is guarded by Chris Paul for 9 seconds of that possession, and then Steph Curry shakes him and gets into the lane, and DeAndre Jordan picks him up for the last second and scores 2 points, and he scores 2 points, then what we are terming fractional counterpoints would be taking those 2 points and dividing up 90-10 between Chris Paul and DeAndre Jordan. Similarly, we can do the same thing for shot attempts. That one shot will be divided up 0.9, 0.1 between Chris Paul and DeAndre Jordan. As kind of a more fair assessment. And doing this allows us to populate something that we're terming the matchup box score. So using the who's guarding whom and the fractional counterpoints and shots against, we can populate we can summarize the defense of the Rockets against the offense of the Spurs in that same December 25th game. And we can see that James Harden's most likely matchup was Kawhi Leonard, as indicated by the blueness of this box. And we're attributing 6.9 of those 12 points that Kawhi scored to James Harden. And this is a simple summary that we can come up with for every game. In fact, now that we have this who's guarding who model, it's all built on that one inference. And we can extend this idea of fractional counterpoints and fractional shots against to the entire season. So per 100 half-court possessions, I'm plotting here all of the guards in blue that we analyzed. On the x-axis, shots against per 100, and on the y-axis, points against per 100, highlighting Chris Paul, who faces, we found, about 11.7 shots and kind of gives up 10.8 counterpoints, one of the best in the NBA. Adding in wings, we can see in the 13-14 season, again, James Harden faces about 18.6 shots and gives up 17.5 counterpoints. And adding in big men, we see Roy Hibbert faces about 19.7 shots, notably the fourth most still in this shots against metric, the fourth most, but only allows about 16.6 counterpoints in the middle of the pack, which is actually kind of an interesting comparison. It's getting to the fact that his disruptive ability is quite good. But so far, these are only really been summaries of observables, and we seek to do better than that with defensive metrics. So for instance, if you're guarding Rajon Rondo all night and he goes 2 for 5 from the three-point line, what does that say about your defensive performance that night? And similarly, if you're guarding Steph Curry and he goes 2 for 5 from the three-point line, what does that say? Something different about your performance that night. So these simple counts, these kind of simple box score summaries don't differentiate between those two examples. And that brings us to this desire. We want our defensive metrics to account for offensive usage and skill. So in order to do that, we actually need to develop a model of offensive usage and skill, particularly by location on the court. And then we can develop a model for defensive suppression and disruption on top of that model. How does a defender perturb change the probabilities of an offensive player, the probability of success of an offensive player, or the probability that an offensive player will take a shot in the first place? And these two things, we term the volume score and the disruption score. So using over 100,000 possessions from the 13-14 season, we fit this big multinomial logistic regression model that sits again on top of this who's guarding whom data, parameterized by an offensive true usage. So this is an offensive offender-specific usage parameter, a fractional defending time. So for this possession, how much of this possession was this offensive player being guarded by a particular defensive player, and then that value is modulated by the volume score, the thing we're trying to measure about the particular defensive player. So intuitively, this is capturing how does the probability of a shot being attempted from a particular region on the court, how is that being changed by that defender's presence or that defender's absence? And we can do carry that idea through to a disruption model. So modeling the probability of success, the field goal percentage of a shot, conditioned on a defender and an offensive player's individual skill. So we have a true kind of efficiency parameter, a true disruption score parameter for a defensive player. Again, these are both referenced spatially, and a distance effect to capture the notion that field goal percentage falls off as distance grows. So this model is pretty big and incorporates thousands of parameters, so visualizing it is actually a pretty important task. And I'm going to throw it back to Alex to talk about these visualizations.
Thanks. So with these spatially referenced volume and disruption scores, we can now introduce the defensive shot chart. So I'm sure a lot of you are used to the offensive shot chart, where the dots represent some notion of the density of where shooters tend to take their shots. Here, the dots represent regions where they're more likely to face shots on defense. And the colors here are reflecting the disruption score that Andy introduced. The size of the dots is representing the volume score. So in this particular case with James Harden, we see a lot of big red dots over the three-point above the break, and that's suggesting that James Harden is facing more threes than you would expect against the average defender above the break, and shooters are making them more often than you would expect on average there. Conversely, the bluer colors would suggest that the defender is doing a good job disrupting the shots. So we can compare James Harden's chart to someone like Kawhi Leonard, who rarely ever faces three-point shots. And that's indicated by all of these tiny small dots around the three-point line. You may not be able to tell, but these three-point lines are also, these dots are also blue, which means when they do take shots against Kawhi Leonard, he's reducing their efficiency. What about point guards? Chris Paul reduces opponents' shot frequency everywhere on the court. Look at all the tiny dots. In fact, again, they're blue over most of the court, which is suggesting that he's also very good at disrupting the shot when they take them. Compare that to someone like Darren Williams, who faces, again, more shots above the break, but when opponents take their shots there, their efficiency is roughly average. We can also look at big men. So Andy mentioned how Roy Hibbert contests 42% of all shots. That's indicated here by this high density of big dots in the paint. However, he's got one of the best disruption scores of any big man in the NBA. When opponents shoot against him in the paint, he's significantly reducing their field goal percentage. This is very different from Dwight Howard, who's got all these tiny points here, which possibly suggests that his presence is actually deterring players from taking shots in the paint in the first place. This is consistent with Kirk Goldsberry's 2013 Sloan paper entitled The Dwight Effect. So far, we've really just looked at individuals, but we have to remember that defense is a team effort. So this is the defensive shot charts for the starting five on the 2013-2014 league's best defense last year, the Indiana Pacers. The first thing you should notice is just how much blue there is on all of this chart. All of these players are significantly reducing opponents' shot efficiency. What we have to keep in mind is that what one player does on a team is going to affect the stats of somebody else. So when we think about Roy Hibbert, he's facing all of this volume in the paint. Does that mean that opponents are trying to exploit Roy Hibbert because he's the weak link? Well, I sort of doubt it. When we look at all of these, we see how good his teammates are in the perimeter. So maybe his teammates are doing a really good job pushing people out of the perimeter into the paint, funneling them towards one of the best big men in the league. So it's just worth keeping in mind, in general, I think in sports analytics, the importance of context. Even though the numbers don't lie, we still need to tell the right origin stories for those numbers. So just to summarize, to characterize defensive skill, we really need to think first about defensive intent. And our approach to that was a model for identifying who's guarding whom at every moment of the possession. From there, we can create this ensemble of metrics. In particular, look at a game-specific summary of defensive points against in a particular game, season-long summaries of shots faced, and points scored against. And finally, we can think about how defenders affect opponents in different parts of the court by looking at the defensive shot charts. We really see this as the beginning. There's other things we're interested in looking at, in particular, how much attention an offensive player draws. So for example, we found that Kevin Durant, when he has the ball, on average has 1.2 people attending to him. Another way of saying that is that 20% of the time he has the ball, he's being double teamed. That's near the top in the NBA. So just think about the implications that has for his teammates. We also focused on defense for this talk, but Andy introduced the offensive effect in our metrics, so we can actually try to understand offense by accounting for defense. Why is Dirk Nowitzki one of the best mid-range shooters in the league? It's not because he's can consistently hit the mid-range shot. It's because he can consistently hit the mid-range shot with a guy in his face. The last thing we're really excited about is defensive expected possession value. So one of my colleagues presented some work here last year looking at how the expected value of the possession changes over time. Now that we have a good model for defense, we can look at how defenders affect the expected possession value over time to get better metrics for defensive ability. Thank you.
questions?
Hi, I was just curious, does your model account for situations where shots are deterred, where the defender comes up to the guy and he maybe does a pump fake, or like how Dwayne Wade jumps up in there and then passes it off? Are those accounted for in this model?
So what's accounted for is the identity of the defender and the distance that defender is to the shooter at the moment of the shot when we think about efficiency. One of the general points I want to make is that I think this is really a start, and one of the keys to good defensive analytics is incorporating more basketball-specific knowledge. So I think there's just tons of room to incorporate more and more situational things into the model like that.
For instance, there's no notion of a pump fake in this data, so we'd have to infer that, which is not a trivial thing to do.
Hey, great work, guys. In the paper, it mentioned that you ignored possessions that ended in a personal foul. I'm just curious how you would think about that in context to volume and disruption, and how that might affect the values.
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the things you'll find with this data is that it's hard to work with, right? It's a lot of data, and so we took a lot of what I would call sort of cutting corners just to make things simpler, like just eliminating possessions with fouls. So I think that's a really good question. Actually, we recently started fitting these who's guarding whom models on possessions with fouls, and it comes down to really deciding, again, how you want to assign points against, say, these counterpoints. So is the guy who commits the foul the one who's responsible for all of the points that the free throw shooter makes? Maybe that's one way to handle it.
So it seems like in your model, defense is kind of binary, right? So either a defender is covering someone or he's not. So have you guys thought of maybe like a fuzzy model where a guy is 60% covering this guy and 40% covering the other guy?
Actually, that is how our model works. So we did simplify it for the visualization. So at every moment of the possession, it's not just a binary, is he covering him or is he not? We give every defender 1 unit of attention that's split amongst the 5 offensive players on the court. I think in a good model, you should see that most of the defenders are often attending primarily to one player. But particularly in those transition moments, you'll see those probabilities dip and then kind of rise up for another offensive player. It's a good question.
Thanks, guys. This is really interesting. One thing I note in all the charts is that there's a lot of very clean distinctions. Like, for example, everybody shoots less and shoots worse from everywhere against Chris Paul. Have you had a chance to run the model again on data from this year to see if those clear distinctions hold up when you see new data?
Yeah, so we don't have access to the data this year, so we were curious about that too. Yeah.
Thanks again for the paper. I wondered, you showed the great breakdown of the Pacers and how they sort of had complementary defensive strengths. Have you tried marginalizing over the whole team to describe sort of what the defensive landscape looks like for a particular lineup?
We haven't explicitly done that. I was just talking to someone about that the other day. I think it would be really awesome to just come up with 30 team defensive shot charts. The other thing we could do is actually add a team-specific effect to these models and see what that looks like, and then each player's shot chart is sort of the residual from that. But I think, yeah, there's a lot of room to do that kind of thing, which would be interesting.
Hey, so I was just wondering, it seems like if a defensive player is close to a guy, then he's playing good defense right now. But is there any way if, like as a coach, you have a game plan, you stay off of one player or anything like that, can you feed the model data of like a game plan of a defensive scheme?
I think this is something I was hoping to allude to before, but this is where we need the most improvement. I think this is the biggest challenge in defensive analytics. So I'm not a basketball expert, but I think we really need statisticians to work with coaches and teams to build these kinds of models that really take into account the schemes and all of the plays. So that's another great point.
So this will be the last question.
Great work, guys. Thanks again. Says that you're modeling the player's defense as a random walk with that equation. Can you talk about that assumption that any of the residuals are going to be random and any verifications you use to confirm that?
So, so on average, we assume that the defender lies in this triangle. It's a hidden Markov model, which means we're borrowing information from both the past and the future to smoothly infer the evolution of defense. And so sometimes the defender may actually be very far from that point, but we know from both past or future history that they were guarding that person, and they will continue to be guarding that person, so probably they're still guarding them. I think we started with something that's conceptually simple. I think it's mathematically fairly involved, but we found that it worked pretty well, just by the eye test from that animation. But definitely, I think incorporating some correlation in those residuals between the average location and their current location would help, right? Because it is a random walk. There is some smooth. What I mean to say is that a defender can't teleport to suddenly a few feet away. So that's something that might be worth incorporating into the model if we think it would help a lot.
Please join me in applauding our presenters.